For 1,000 years, there was one rule every commander in the world understood. You did not take Constantinople by storm. 23 sieges had broken against its triple walls, Avars and Arabs and Bulgars and Rus, and every one of them had gone home or died trying. The walls were older than most of the kingdoms that threw armies at them, built by an emperor whose grandchildren were already legend. On a spring morning in 1453, a young sultan stood in front of those walls with an idea that none of the failed besiegers had owned. He had brought a machine. 53 days later, the rule that had held for 10 centuries was gone for good, and so was the Roman Empire, and so, in a sense, was the Middle Ages. This is the story of how a wall stops working. It is also the story of the men on both sides of it, a last emperor with no empire, and a young sultan who could not sleep, and of the single object that decided between them. The contemporaries knew they were watching the end of something. They did not yet know it was the beginning of the gunpowder age. The Venetian surgeon, Niccolo Barbaro, kept a diary through every day of the siege, and Greek and Italian survivors wrote down what they saw, so we can follow these 53 days almost hour by hour. Walk into Constantinople in 1452, and the first thing you notice is the emptiness. This was once the largest city in Christendom, 500,000 people inside the greatest fortifications ever built. Now perhaps 50,000 remain, and the pro-Ottoman historian Kritouvelos, who admired the conquerors, still called it a city in name only. Whole districts inside the walls had gone back to orchards and vineyards and grazing. The Roman Empire that Augustus founded had shrunk to this single city and a few scraps of coastline, a head with almost no body left, ruled by an emperor named Constantine, the 11th of that name, the same name as the man who built the place 11 centuries before. The city still had its walls, and they were the reason it had survived this long. The land walls ran 4 miles across the peninsula, and they were not one wall, but a system. An attacker crossed a moat, then faced a low outer wall, then a terrace, then the great inner wall 40 feet high and studded with 96 towers. Break through the first, and you stood in a killing ground under the second. The Emperor Theodosius II had finished them in the 5th century, against catapults and rams and scaling ladders, and against those weapons they were close to perfect. No one had broken the land walls by force in 1,000 years. Constantine knew what was coming, and he spent the last year doing the only things a doomed ruler can. He sent letters west begging for help, and the price the Pope named was the union of the Greek and Latin churches, a wound 4 centuries deep. A reconciliation service was held in Hagia Sophia, and the city nearly rioted. The Grand Duke Notaras is remembered saying he would rather see the Turkish turban in the city than the Latin hat. Venice sent a few ships. The real help came from one man, a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani, who arrived in January with 700 professional fighters and a reputation for defending walls. The emperor gave him command of the section everyone knew the blow would fall on. The machine that broke the walls began as a job offer the Byzantines turned down. A cannon founder from the Hungarian lands, known to history as Orban, came to Constantinople first and offered the emperor his services. Constantine could not pay him. The treasury that had once funded an empire could not afford one engineer, and Orban walked across the lines to the sultan, who could afford anything. The Byzantine historian Ducas says Orban would have taken a quarter of what the Ottomans gave him. The city lost the man who would kill it because it had run out of money, which is its own kind of mechanism. The slow way empires fall before the fast way arrives. Mehmed asked Orban whether he could cast a gun big enough to break the walls of Constantinople, and Orban answered that he could break the walls of Babylon. Over the winter, he cast a bronze monster whose true size no one could quite agree on, a barrel more than 25 feet long that threw a stone ball the size of a man across a mile of air. It needed 60 oxen and 200 men to drag it, and a crew of men walking ahead to level the road and strengthen the bridges under its weight. It could be fired only a handful of times a day because it had to cool or it would burst. It was slow, clumsy, and dangerous to its own crew, and it did not matter because it was aimed at something that could not move. The great gun has the fame, but it never worked alone. The Venetian Barbaro, watching from inside, counted batteries of guns ranged along the walls, and in all the Ottomans fielded scores of cannon of every size. The giant bombard set amongst smaller, faster pieces that kept the pressure on the stone between its slow, earth-shaking shots. This was the real innovation. Not one freak weapon, but a whole artillery train. An army that had learned to think in gunpowder while its enemies still thought in stone. The Ottomans had taken a technology that Europe invented and out-organized the inventors at using it. Here is why that one ugly machine mattered more than the army behind it. A medieval wall is built to survive impacts that arrive slowly and scattered. A catapult stone here, a ram blow there, spread across the stonework so the mass of the wall absorbs them. A cannon does the opposite. It strikes the same narrow place again and again at a speed nothing in the old world had ever moved, and stone that can shrug off 1,000 small blows cracks under a few dozen concentrated ones. The Theodosian walls were a brilliant answer to a question that, in the winter of 1452, stopped being the question. Orban had not built a better siege engine. He had made siege engines history. Mehmed understood that a gun alone does not take a city. A city takes supplies, reinforcements, hope from outside, and so before he brought the cannon, he cut the arteries. The year before the siege, he built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus at its narrowest point, half a mile of water, directly across from a fortress his great-grandfather had raised on the Asian side. Between the two, Ottoman guns could now close the strait. They called the new fortress Rumeli Hisari. The Greeks called it the throat cutter because everyone could see exactly what it was for. Fortress made its point quickly. In November, a Venetian ship tried to run the strait without stopping, and the guns sank it, and the survivors were executed. After that, the message was plain. No fleet would relieve Constantinople from the Black Sea, and the city that had always been fed and reinforced by sea was now, for the first time, cut off. When Mehmed brought his army up in April, the defenders looked out on a host contemporaries put at 80,000 and more, though medieval armies were always counted generously, and the true figure was likely smaller. Against it, Constantine had perhaps 7,000 men to hold 4 miles of wall. The arithmetic was already hopeless. The walls were supposed to make arithmetic not matter. One stretch of water still belonged to the city. The Golden Horn, the long harbour along the city's northern flank, was protected by a great iron chain slung across its mouth on floating barrels, an old device that had turned away fleets before. Behind the chain, the Christian ships were safe, and the northern sea walls could be lightly held, because no enemy could reach them. For the first weeks of the siege, the chain held, and the Ottoman fleet battered at it and could not break in. Mehmed had cut every artery but this one, and this one was about to teach him to think sideways. If a fleet cannot go through the chain, Mehmed reasoned, it can go around it, over dry land. In a single night, his engineers laid a road of greased timbers across the ridge of Galata, the hill behind the harbour, and hauled warships up one side and down the other, on rollers and ox teams and the backs of men. The defenders woke to find Ottoman galleys floating inside the Golden Horn, behind the chain, behind the safe water, threatening the one stretch of wall the city had counted on never having to defend in force. The historians Barbaro and Kritovulos both describe it, and both grasp what it meant. The harm reached well past the military, though it was military too. Constantine now had to pull men from the land walls, the walls under the cannon, to guard the harbour walls he had thought secure, stretching 7,000 defenders, even thinner, across an even longer line. The deeper damage was to the mind. A wall is partly a feeling. The feeling that there is a place the enemy cannot reach, and Mehmed had just shown that there was no such place, that he would carry his ships over a mountain rather than accept a closed door. For a defender, the most dangerous thing an attacker can prove is that the rules you trusted do not bind him. Through April and May, the great gun did its slow work. Each day it fired a handful of times into the same section of the mesotachion, the middle wall where the land dips into the valley of the Lycus, the weakest point and the one Justiniani held. Each day a little more wall came down. Each night the defenders rebuilt it with rubble, earth and barrels, and the makeshift stockade of broken stone and timber held better against cannonballs than the proud old masonry had, because loose-packed earth absorbs a shot where dressed stone shatters. It was a strange duel, a wall being unbuilt by day and rebuilt worse, but tougher by night, and the question was only which side ran out first. Underground, the siege had its own war. Ottoman sappers, many of them Serbian silver miners, dug tunnels toward the walls to collapse them from beneath, and the defenders dug to meet them, listening for the scrape of picks through pots of water set on the ground to catch the tremor. When the tunnels met, men fought and died in the dark, with knives and fire and smoke, and the defenders won that war underground, finding and flooding and burning the mines one by one. They could win below the ground and still be losing above it, because the cannon never stopped, and there were always more Ottoman soldiers, and there were never any more defenders. By late May, the defenders were spent. They had not slept properly in weeks. The breaches were widening faster than they could be filled, and the coalition inside the walls was fraying along its old seams. Venetians blaming Genoese, Greeks resenting both. A rumor of a relief fleet rising and then dying when a ship sent to find it returned alone over the empty sea. Constantine rode the walls each night, and witnesses described omens: a strange light over the dome of Hagia Sophia, an eclipse, a procession where the icon of the Virgin slipped from its bearers into the mud. The people read these as the city being abandoned by its protectors. Whether or not heaven was leaving, the powder and the stone were not. Mehmed offered terms one last time, the customary chance to surrender and live. The city refused, and the Sultan set his final assault for the small hours of the 29th of May. He sent his men in waves, by design, to wear the defenders down. The first wave was the irregulars, the lightly armed and the expendable, thrown against the broken mesotachion to exhaust the defense and use up its strength. Giustiniani and his men cut them down and held. The second wave was provincial troops, better armed, and they too broke on the stockade. The walls, even ruined, even held by 7,000 exhausted men, were still doing their terrible work. Then Mehmed sent the third wave, the Janissaries, his elite slave soldiers, disciplined and fresh and advancing in good order, while the defenders had been fighting for hours. Two things broke at once in that last push. Giustiniani was hit, badly, struck through his armor, and bleeding and in great pain, he asked to be carried back through the inner wall to be tended. His Genoese, seeing their commander leave, began to follow him, and a gap opened in the defense exactly where the line was thinnest. The emperor begged him to stay. He could not or would not, and he was carried to a ship, and he died of the wound within days. Near that gap was a small sallyport called the Kerker Porter, which had been left unbarred, and a party of Ottoman soldiers found it and got onto the wall and raised their banner. To the defenders below, the sight of an enemy flag flying above them did what hours of assault had not. The line broke. Constantine's own end is tradition rather than record. The last Roman emperor is said to have thrown off the marks of his rank and charged into the breach to die as a soldier, and no one ever found his body to prove or disprove it. The empire that began with one Constantine ended with another, and the difference between them was 1100 years and a single morning. By the customs of the age, a city taken by storm belonged to the soldiers, and Mehmed had promised them their 3 days. What followed was the sack, the killing and the enslaving and the stripping of a city, and the documentary tradition records it plainly without dwelling on it, because the people who survived it could not afford to look away, and we should not pretend it was clean. Thousands who had fled to Hagia Sophia for sanctuary were taken there. By the standards of medieval sieges, it was neither the worst nor the most merciful. By any standard, it was the end of a world that had thought itself eternal. Mehmed rode into the city in the afternoon, 21 years old, and went straight to Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, 900 years old, and ordered it preserved and made a mosque. He took for himself a new title that the Ottomans would carry for centuries, Fatih, the Conqueror. Tradition puts a famous couplet in his mouth as he walked the empty halls of the Byzantine palace, an old Persian verse about how the spider weaves the curtain in the palace of the Caesars and the owl calls the watch in the towers of long-dead kings. Whether he said it or not, it caught the thing exactly. A young man standing in the ruins of an empire older than memory, now his. The fall scattered something besides people. For centuries, Constantinople had been the vault of Greek learning, the place where the texts of antiquity were copied and guarded. And as the danger grew and then arrived, Greek scholars carried their manuscripts west into Italy. Plato and Aristotle, and Homer in the original tongue, arriving in Florence and Venice in the very decades the Renaissance was catching fire. It is too neat to say 1453 caused the rebirth of classical learning, and the movement was already underway. And yet, the timing is real. The empire died and helped seed the revival of the ancient world it had spent 1,000 years keeping alive. Mehmed never saw himself as the destroyer of Rome. He saw himself as its heir. He called himself Caesari Rum, Caesar of the Romans, and set about making the gutted city into a capital again, resettling it, rebuilding it, inviting Greeks and Armenians and Jews to populate it, until within a generation, Constantinople was once more the largest city in Europe, under a new name the Turks had used informally for a long time, Istanbul. The empire of the Caesars did not so much end as change owners. The walls that had defined it for 1,000 years were now just walls, and the man who broke them slept inside them. News of the fall went west, and it went fast. And everywhere it landed, it carried the same quiet terror. If the walls of Constantinople could fall, no wall was safe. For 1,000 years, the great stone fortress had been the final answer in war, the thing you retreated behind when all else failed. And in 53 days, a sultan with a foundry had turned the final answer into a question. Every prince in Europe who owned a castle now understood that his castle had an expiration date, and the date was however long it took gunpowder to arrive. The thing that replaced the high stone wall shows how complete the change was. Within a few generations, fortification across Europe turned itself inside out. The tall vertical walls built to be unclimbable came down, and in their place, engineers built low, thick, angled earthworks designed to absorb cannon fire and to mount cannon of their own, a style so associated with Italian designers that it took their name. The castle of the storybooks, with its high battlements and its single proud keep, was made obsolete by Constantinople, and it was replaced by something that looked less like a fortress and more like a buried star. War had a new physics, and the old silhouette of safety was finished. There is a temptation to make 1453 a story about one cannon, and the cannon matters, but the deeper lesson is older and colder. The strongest defense in the world is strong only against the weapons it was built for, and the day someone changes the weapon, 1,000 years of confidence becomes 1,000 years of obsolete stone. The men on those walls were neither weak nor foolish. They were defending brilliantly against the last war, while the next one was being cast in a foundry across the lines. Empires rarely fall because their defenders stop being brave. They fall because the world quietly changed the rules, and the walls were the last to know. If history like this is worth your evenings, the channel tells more of it, built from the original accounts, with the legends labeled as legends.